The town looked ordinary enough when I drove in. If you weren't paying close attention. Just another small southern town, tucked away like a forgotten relic in the dusty backroads of South Carolina. But it didn't take long to feel the eyes on me. The quiet stares that seemed to follow every step. I'd been around long enough to recognize it the way a place could be both still and simmering. The silence speaking volumes. Here, they didn't roll out the welcome mat for someone new. Especially someone who wasn't born and raised among them. My name's David McAllister, 54 years old, been in law enforcement most of my life. And I've seen my share of both good and bad. Yet there was something different here. Something layered, like the quiet look someone gives you that's both familiar and dismissive. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. And if you weren't from here, well, you were nobody. I was supposed to be the new chief of police. But I hadn't told anyone yet. Thought I'd take a stroll first. Get a feel for what I was dealing with. So there I was, walking through the main street in worn-out boots. An old jacket that had seen better days. Blending in as much as a stranger could. First stop was the local cafe, a place that looked like it had served up a million cups of coffee and heard a million quiet whispers over its wooden tables. The minute I walked in, heads turned, just for a second, but it was enough. 2 cops sitting at the back, their uniforms crisp. Badges catching the dim light, smirked in my direction. Then went back to laughing. I knew the type. Small town, big badge, the kind that held their position close to the chest. They looked at me, but they didn't see me. Just a man they could ignore. Or worse, entertain themselves with. I ordered a coffee and lingered, wondering if one of them might recognize the hint of authority in my face or the way I carried myself. But they didn't. They were busy sizing me up in that quiet, passive way that isn't quite outright aggression. But it's close enough. Maybe in their minds, I was already another story to tell. Another name to forget. I wasn't in the mood for trouble. I hadn't come here to make waves yet. But as I turned to leave, one of them called out. Just loud enough to make sure everyone heard. Hey, old man, you lost? Don't look like you're from around here. I kept my face blank. Turned just enough to see them out of the corner of my eye. Just passing through, I replied, keeping it short, giving them nothing to work with. I could tell they weren't buying it. Though, the taller one, Jake, with a smirk that said he thought he had it all figured out, leaned forward, eyes narrowed with an edge that was both challenging and amused. Well, he said, drawing it out, maybe keep passing. Strangers don't last long around here if you get my drift. It was the kind of thing a man like me didn't need spelled out. I'd heard it before, felt it, seen it in countless other places where outsiders weren't welcome. I let it go, walked out with the feeling that maybe this town was about to be a lot more than paperwork and polite meetings. Maybe it was about to reveal more than it meant to. The next morning, I laced up my shoes for a run just outside of town. It was early, the air thick and still, like it was holding its breath. I'd barely hit my stride when I heard the rumble of a patrol car behind me. Its lights off but close enough that I could feel the eyes watching. Sure enough, it was Jake and his partner Mike. The same duo from the cafe. Jake leaned out of the window, his voice carrying that same smug tone from yesterday. You lost, runner? He called, as if I'd wandered into some private territory without permission. Just getting my morning in, I replied, keeping my pace steady. My tone calm, but they weren't here to share the road. Mike, his partner, who had the build of a man who relied on intimidation, chimed in. Maybe don't stick around too long. This place doesn't exactly give strangers the warmest welcome. It wasn't a suggestion. Before I could say another word, they'd parked the car and stepped out, walking toward me with an unhurried pace, like they had all the time in the world to make their point. Jake stepped closer than was necessary, and started patting my pockets without a word. He wasn't looking for anything. This was about setting a tone. As he pulled out a random scrap of plastic I'd forgotten about. He held it up like it was some damning piece of evidence. Smirking. This yours? I kept my eyes steady on him. Said nothing. This was their show, and I wasn't interested in giving them any more of my time. But they weren't finished. Without another word, they each grabbed an arm, hauling me down the road like they'd bagged some big city criminal. No one stopped to ask what I'd done. A few folks looked on. Some curious. Others with that faint smirk that told me this wasn't anything new. By the time we reached the center of town, a small crowd had gathered, watching as they tied me to a lamppost. Hands bound, like I was some kind of spectacle. Jake was putting on a show. Basking in it, announcing to anyone who'd listened that I was just some drifter with a bad attitude. I could see him scanning the crowd, soaking up the attention. Phones came out, recording, and Jake leaned in close enough for his voice to carry over the crowd. "Can't have strangers wandering into our town," he sneered, eyes flashing with a twisted pride. There was nothing left to say. Nothing that could change the weight of a town that turned a blind eye. That laughed it off as harmless fun when it was anything but. The truth was there, settled into the quiet spaces between laughter. In the looks that the townsfolk gave each other. To them, this was tradition, the way things had always been. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By morning, the town was buzzing. Word had spread fast. Clips of me tied to that lamppost had circulated online. Each one sparking more whispers. More questions. Out there in the open. It had looked like a harmless prank, a couple of local cops having fun with a stranger. But anyone looking closely could see the cracks. The quiet smirk on Jake's face. The satisfaction in Mike's. It was a small town with a big sense of control. And they liked it that way. Only now, for the first time, that control was slipping. Early that morning, the call came from headquarters. The higher-ups wanted to know what the hell was going on down in nowhere. South Carolina, a chief of police humiliated in the center of town. His hands tied around a lamppost. All for the public to see. It didn't sit right. My phone buzzed with more calls. Messages piling up from folks I hadn't heard from in years. They all wanted the same thing. Answers. But I knew there was only one answer worth giving. And it was about time. I walked into the station just before noon. Wearing my uniform, the badge on my chest a subtle reminder of the authority these two men had ignored. I could feel it the second I walked through the door. The laughter died down. Voices quieted. This wasn't the kind of silence I'd known back home. This was something deeper. Something that held decades of secrets, alliances, and silent approvals. And as I stepped in, it was as if that silence began to unravel. Jake and Mike were standing near the main desk, laughing about something, as oblivious as they'd been the day before. They hadn't checked who I was. They hadn't thought to ask. They just assumed, the way people assume when they don't see past the surface. When they let their own sense of power cloud their judgment. But the moment they spotted me in my uniform, the laughter stopped. I let the silence settle. I wanted them to feel the weight of it. To feel what it was like to stand on the other side. Watched. Judged. They looked around the room, searching for some kind of support. But there was none to be found. Their audience from the day before was gone. Replaced by officers who now looked uneasy. Realizing just how deep this mistake ran. Finally, I broke the silence. My voice calm, almost conversational. "We've got ourselves a situation. Gentlemen," I said, looking them square in the eyes. "And you're both right in the middle of it." Jake opened his mouth, some excuse already forming on his lips. But I raised a hand, stopping him before he could speak. "Save it, Jake. I've seen enough to know exactly what's been going on here." I took a step closer, holding his gaze steady, watching the confidence drain from his face. "So," I asked, letting my words fall into the quiet, "neither of you recognized your new chief?" The room held its breath. The look on Jake's face was almost unreadable, caught between shock and something that looked a lot like shame. I didn't move, didn't let the weight of the moment shift. Around us, the rest of the officers exchanged glances, piecing together what had happened, realizing that this wasn't just a minor misstep. This was something deeper, a habit. A pattern of behavior left unchecked for far too long. Jake tried to pull himself together, standing a bit straighter, the defiance creeping back into his posture. "Look, Chief, this is just how things work here," he said, his voice carrying a quiet desperation. "Tradition, you know? We have a little fun with outsiders. Keeps people in line. Tradition." I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "So, it's tradition to humiliate someone in the middle of town. To show them they don't belong?" Jake's smirk wavered, but he held it, as though searching the room for support. It's not hurting anyone, Chief. Just a bit of harmless fun. But as I glanced around, I could see that support slipping away. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, some looking down, others watching with a mix of unease and understanding. They knew this was about more than a harmless tradition. This was about a culture that had quietly accepted that some people had the power to say who belonged and who didn't. And now, for the first time, they were seeing the weight of that choice. I took my time, letting the silence do the talking. This wasn't about me or even Jake and Mike. This was about the choices this town had made. The silent lines it had drawn between us and them. Lines that were so easy to ignore when it suited them, when the rules only applied to those they considered outsiders. Without another word, I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 termination forms. In that quiet, still room, I signed them both, one by one. I looked up at Jake and Mike. Their faces pale now, the weight of their tradition settling heavily on their shoulders. Hand over your badges, I said, my voice calm but firm. Your time here is done. Around us, the room stayed silent, no cheers or applause, just the kind of heavy, grounded silence that speaks of truth finally unearthed. Jake and Mike removed their badges slowly, their faces empty, as though the realization was finally sinking in. They weren't untouchable, they weren't beyond accountability, and the people around them were starting to see it, too. After they left, there was a stillness in the room, a weight that wouldn't lift so easily. But it was a beginning. The quietest ones, the ones who'd stood by and watched for years, now looked around, seeing each other with something closer to recognition. This wasn't just about 2 officers gone too far. This was about a community. About the small betrayals that had allowed such things to happen in the first place. In the coming days, as the story spread beyond the town, the calls from the media didn't stop. Each one digging deeper, uncovering more of what lay beneath. The prosecutor's office launched an investigation, and it didn't take long to find others willing to come forward. Voices that had been silent for years. Each voice was a story, a reminder that beneath the quiet surface of every small town, there are truths left unspoken, lines drawn to keep things comfortable. But comfort comes at a price. And here in this town, the price had been too high. The past was unraveling, and there was no turning back. That morning, as I walked out of the station, the crowd outside had grown. People gathered, some with questions, others with demands. They held signs, their words quiet but resolute. And for the first time, I saw the lines beginning to blur. The weight of old assumptions shifting as the town stood together, seeing itself as it really was. And as I walked through that crowd, I knew this was the start of something different. This wasn't just about Jake and Mike. It was about more than a job. More than tradition. It was about giving this town a chance to choose something better. It was about finding a new way forward. A way that didn't leave anyone on the outside looking in. In the days that followed, the town began to feel different, even if only in the quietest of ways. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself with fanfare or spectacle, but with an awareness, a subtle shifting in the air, as though everyone had paused to listen a little closer. Jake and Mike were gone, and in their absence, the town started to see itself more clearly. The cracks that had gone unnoticed, the lines that had quietly divided us from them. With the prosecutor's office now digging into Jake and Mike's records, every questionable arrest, every uneven encounter came under the light. It was as if a door had been opened, and the darkness that had settled comfortably in the corners of this small town was finally being seen. And in that light, the stories started to come forward. They were stories shared in low voices. People speaking of moments they'd tucked away. Moments that had seemed too small to mention or too complicated to explain. A farmer who'd once been dragged out of his truck on a summer night, questioned for no reason other than he'd taken a wrong turn. A young woman who'd been searched in the middle of the street simply for walking home a bit too late. Each story revealed another thread in a web that had quietly held this town together, tying some people tightly in place while others moved freely. But these weren't the kind of revelations that demanded justice with loud voices or clenched fists. Instead, the people came quietly, sometimes barely meeting my eyes. As if sharing their stories was just as hard as the moments themselves. They hadn't expected things to change. They hadn't even expected to be believed. The silence of a small town can be heavy that way. Like a slow, steady weight that everyone learns to carry. The courtroom, which had often stood empty or echoed with the sounds of familiar faces, was suddenly filled with new voices. People who had never felt a place here now found themselves with the power to speak. To be heard. As the days wore on, the town itself became part of the testimony. Each story another reminder that the lines Jake and Mike had enforced weren't drawn in stone. They were choices, decisions made by people who saw themselves on one side and everyone else on the other. For some, the hardest part was realizing that the world they thought they knew was built on silent complicity. That this wasn't just about two officers going too far. It was about a way of life. A habit of looking away. A pattern that, day after day, had grown into something unspoken and accepted. And maybe it wasn't as overt or vicious as it might have been in another place or time. But it was there all the same, a quiet agreement that strangers stayed strangers. That the rules bent for some and hardened for others. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Jake and Mike's influence had touched more than a few lives. People who'd been isolated by this town's quiet suspicion of outsiders started to emerge. Their voices finally breaking through. They were no longer just isolated events or misunderstandings, they were patterns. Each one echoing the others. Each one revealing the way lines had been drawn without anyone needing to say a word. One afternoon, as I gathered the remaining officers in the main hall, the room felt different, heavier, but not with the usual sense of unspoken alliances. This was something else. Something that came from seeing things clearly for the first time. I looked around the room, meeting each gaze, taking in the mix of unease, realization, and something that might have been relief. For those who hadn't been involved, there was a sense of reckoning, an acknowledgement that they'd allowed these things to happen under their watch. And for those who'd stood by, quietly benefiting from the ways things had always been, there was no more comfort left to hold onto. We're moving forward, I told them, my voice steady but quiet. And that means change. It means a standard, not just for some, but for everyone who lives here. There was no applause, no loud affirmation, but as I spoke, the weight in the room shifted. As if a tension held too long had finally been released. In the days that followed, we introduced new protocols, measures to ensure that this force would serve every member of this community without question. Without bias. And for the first time, the weight of the badge felt lighter. It felt like something we could hold honestly. The change wasn't quick or easy. There were moments of pushback. The lingering murmurings of people resistant to seeing themselves or their town any differently than they always had. There were those who still saw Jake and Mike's actions as harmless. As part of a tradition. A way of keeping things orderly and predictable. But others, quieter voices that had often gone unheard, began to speak a little louder. These voices didn't demand retribution or revenge. They simply asked for respect. For a sense of belonging that didn't come with conditions or warnings. Walking through town, I began to see those voices in the faces of people I'd only known from afar. I saw them in the nods exchanged between neighbors. The way some of the townsfolk looked each other in the eye a little longer. As if seeing, really seeing, each other for the first time. And in those quiet exchanges, there was the beginning of something new, a community not built on who belonged and who didn't, but on the silent understanding that we were all here, sharing the same streets, the same quiet, steady life. Change came slowly, but it came. There were still glances from people who held onto the past, who looked at me like I was an interruption, a ripple in their still waters. But they were starting to understand that the lines they'd drawn didn't serve them anymore. And as the weeks wore on, the questions faded, replaced by a sense of acceptance. Not just of me, but of everyone who had quietly stood on the edges, waiting to be seen. One evening, as the sun settled low over the quiet streets, I walked back to the station, the shadows growing long and familiar. I stopped for a moment, looking out over the town that was, little by little, finding its way forward. The changes weren't loud or obvious, but they were there, like new roots settling into old soil. This town had always been still, silent, a place where time felt suspended. But now, there was a new kind of quiet. One that didn't carry the weight of exclusion or whispered judgments. It was a quiet that held space for everyone. For voices that had been silenced. For people who had always felt like strangers in their own home. As I reached the station, I took one last look back, feeling that stillness in a way I hadn't before. This town wasn't just waking up, it was finding itself. Learning to see beyond the easy lines that had kept it bound. And though the work wasn't finished, though there was much yet to uncover, I knew we'd begun to move forward. Each step a little closer to something honest. Something shared. The quiet had changed, and with it, so had the town. And in that quiet, a promise had been made. One that didn't need words to be understood. The dust had begun to settle in the small town, though it left an indelible mark. A faint yet persistent reminder of what had been and what could be. There was no sudden shift. No grand moment of reconciliation. But a gradual, nearly imperceptible softening. The town was quiet, as it always had been. But now the silence held something new, a kind of mutual acknowledgement. A settling into shared ground where lines were no longer quite as sharp. Where strangers were no longer watched with suspicion but seen as simply part of the fabric of life here. In the aftermath of Jake and Mike's departure, the courthouse became a stage for voices long held in check. One after another, townsfolk stepped forward, telling stories that, individually, might have seemed trivial but together painted a picture of a place that had clung too long to unspoken codes. Codes that gave some people power while keeping others on the outside. Always one step removed. No one admitted outright to racial bias. But the stories spoke for themselves. In the silences between words and in the uneasy looks exchanged across the courtroom. Each story was a thread in a larger narrative. An account of a place that had, for years, found ways to keep certain people at arm's length. There was the mechanic who recalled being stopped on his way home from late shifts. The out-of-town schoolteacher who'd endured cold stares in the grocery aisle. The young man whose only fault was walking the streets alone at dusk. One after another, they shared moments of isolation, of subtle but unmistakable reminders that they weren't quite one of us. Listening to them, I could feel the depth of that quiet pain, the ways it had settled into people's lives like an uninvited guest. Coloring their view of this town, their sense of safety, their belief in a place they could truly call home. And for every voice that spoke up, there were others still silent. People who hadn't yet found the words, or maybe the courage, to bring their stories to light. The media interest had faded, the reporters moving on to newer stories. But the town remained, carrying the weight of what had been uncovered. It was a weight that didn't simply vanish but seemed to linger. Casting shadows on the everyday interactions. In the lingering glances and faintly apologetic smiles that said, "We see you now, even if we hadn't before." With time, as these stories worked their way into the town's consciousness, a new awareness took root. It was fragile, hesitant, but it was there. People were starting to look each other in the eye a bit longer. Nodding at folks they might have once ignored. Making space in subtle ways that didn't need words. Small gestures, unremarkable on their own, but together, they started to fill the gaps left by years of unspoken divisions. In the police force, the changes were more direct, more intentional, protocols were redefined, and every officer underwent new training. Not just in the rules of the job but in the respect the badge required. Officers learned that authority wasn't a shield to hide behind, but a responsibility to uphold. A duty to each and every resident. The morning briefings grew longer, filled with discussions about the community, about fairness, about understanding. It wasn't the kind of transformation you could see on the surface. But it was happening, day by day, choice by choice. Some resisted, of course. There were murmurs among the older officers. Those who felt the good old days slipping away. The comfort of tradition giving way to something less predictable. But even they began to sense that things had shifted. That their usual assumptions no longer carried the weight they once had. And in the absence of those assumptions, there was a new kind of clarity. A way of seeing each other as individuals. As neighbors. Instead of roles to be filled or rules to be enforced. As the weeks turned into months, the town's routines resumed. the days falling back into their familiar rhythm. The courthouse quieted. The signs of protest disappeared. But a subtle change remained. There was an awareness now. A willingness to listen. Even in the quiet, everyday exchanges, people who might never have spoken to each other now stopped to chat. However briefly, at the post office or the grocery store. They weren't friends. Not yet. But the space between them had grown smaller. The invisible lines less defined. One evening, I joined a community event in the town square. A simple gathering that the town had hosted for years but now felt different. As though it carried a new significance. People mingled in small clusters. Children chased each other across the grass. And the old streetlights cast a soft glow over the scene, illuminating faces that now looked at each other with a quiet respect. I stood back, watching, feeling a sense of peace. Not just in what had changed but in knowing that change could come at all. There was no applause, no speeches, just the calm hum of conversation, of people standing shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same space without the need to look away. And as I looked around, I felt the weight of my role settle into something more enduring. Less about enforcement and more about stewardship. This town didn't need a leader who wielded authority from a distance but someone willing to stand among them. To listen as much as to speak. To respect as much as to command. When I finally turned to leave, the night had fallen, the quiet descending like a blanket over the town, softening the edges, blending the old divisions into something more whole. It was just a beginning. A slow, patient beginning that might never be complete. But it was enough. In the end, that was the legacy I wanted to leave behind, not a town that had erased its past but one that had learned from it. One that knew the weight of silence and chose, instead, to fill it with voices. And in that choice, there was the promise of a future. One in which every person here could belong. Could find a place without question or judgment. In the quiet, steady way that only a town like this could offer.